Okay, well listen, this is what we're going to do. We've got 80 minutes, and that's not very much time, right? So what we're going to do, I'm going to say right now, just really quickly, tell your table mates who you are. We're not going to do the big room because it takes too much time, right? But tell your table mates who you are, really quickly. Okay, let's draw back together, and I'll introduce myself, and we'll get started on this journey of understanding trauma. My name is Ruby Johnston. I am one of the co-founders of LAM International, the Global Capacity Building Network. And what my husband and I do with our team is we travel the globe and work in developing countries, bringing capacity building initiatives and helping to develop capacity building systems. So a capacity building system would be one in which training would occur, consultation, organizational development, leadership training, those kinds of things. So that's what we do. We've been doing this since 2002. And any of you know the organization ILDC in Ukraine? Anybody here ever hear it? No, you haven't. Heard a lot about Ukraine on the stage. Well, we founded that organization. We have a number of other organizations in other countries, but that's kind of boring stuff for you, so I won't go there. But anyway, what we're going to be doing here is to be looking at trauma. And specifically, this is a trauma program that I developed specifically as a smaller portion of a larger program for the forum. So the roadmap that you have, what you're going to have in that roadmap, you get a link to this curriculum. You get a link to the PowerPoints, the handouts, and the trainer guide. So your trainer guide will look, and if you decide to download it, will look like this. And in that trainer guide, it will be a good resource for you if you want to use it in your ministries to raise awareness. So you see on the left-hand side, there's the PowerPoints in my trainer guide. And then on the right-hand side are the notes for you as a trainer that help you to walk through it. So it walks through every moment by moment, what PowerPoint you would want to use and what handout you should put with it, okay? In addition to that, this is just a 3-hour awareness session for you. What we've discovered in working with trauma is that it's needed by everyone who's working with orphans and vulnerable children and crisis families. Would you agree? Agree? The other thing we're finding is that when we're serving the church is saying and pastors are saying, oh my goodness, my people need to know this. And here's the reason, and let's give a little context to this. When we look at trauma and we look at the different venues in which we serve families and children, we don't always know their history or their background. So in a church situation in particular, when a family comes into that church, generally they're there because they want to be refreshed, they want to recover, they want their spiritual life enriched, and they've come to the church with a decision that this is a place that I'm going to grow and develop in that journey of my faith. Would you agree? What we don't know many times is that family may have come into the church having left domestic violence. They may have left abuse and neglect of their children. They may have left addictions of one sort or another in which their children were suffering as a result of the crisis that the family might have been in. There might have been financial problems, etc. So when we're sitting in a situation in the church, we often don't see the history, the background, the years before the family is here. But what we do know is that each and every one of us sitting here today have come out of some sort of trauma. We've all experienced at least one trauma in our life, maybe one little event that was traumatic for us. So if we're thinking about that, then we have to stretch further and say, if I'm going to serve crisis families, serve my church, serve my NGO that I'm working in well, I need to make sure I create a foundation of understanding of what trauma is and what it does to children and to families. Make sense? Okay. So when we, the team at WWO, were talking about what we wanted to make available to you, we decided that we wanted to take what we're doing globally, we're doing a trauma training across the globe, an 8-module training program and give you a 3-hour awareness program. So this is awareness, and this is for you to use any way you want to use it. We offer it to you and give it to you. I'm glad you're here because let's just build a little foundation of understanding. And so take what's here and pull some pieces out of it, and then look at how does it apply to us so we can walk away even from this session feeling more equipped to actually talk to people and to engage with people that may have experienced trauma. So as we begin, and I'm going to ask you at any time, please stop me and ask questions, because we've only got 80 minutes. And you may have a question, and if you try to wait until I stop breathing and take a break, you may be waiting a long time. So raise your hand, be willing to stop me, and we'll answer questions. And I'm okay at saying, you know what, we've talked about this long enough now, let's move on. So I can do that as well. So let's be okay with that. When we look at, again, for us to become aware and to become part of the journey of being competent in trauma, we have to understand there are many different facets that are important to us. Our trauma series, and what we've come to understand, is that we need to understand the foundation trauma, what trauma does to people. So we start out with that and looking at 3 days and spending intense time of looking at trauma and what it is and what it does to the brain. Then we've also come to understand, and it's very important that we understand our senses and sensory integration and sensory processing disorder. Children who have experienced trauma have a very high percentage of challenges. A high percentage of those children have challenges in sensory issues. Many of them have sensory integration issues. You all know that children with autism are very high in percentages of children who have sensory processing disorder. So we have a module that we really dig into that. So we as a layperson can look at the 8 senses, not 5, 8 senses. And if you want to know what the other 3 are, you have to ask a question later. But there are 8 senses. But we have really an understanding that's very important that if we're going to work with children, we need to understand that and understand sensory challenges. Then the 3rd module that we really feel is critical. Children who have experienced trauma often do not know how to manage their own emotions. Have you seen that? They are volatile sometimes in their emotions, or they're numb in their emotions. They don't have words for emotions. And what we know, children can't be successful if they can't learn to manage their emotions. They'll get fired from a job. The first time a boss says to them, go move that big pile to over there, and the young person says, I don't like doing that. And the boss says, that's your job. No, I'm not doing it, and then there's this little bit of emotional charge that starts, and before long, people are fighting and arguing, and then you said, you're fired. I'm the boss. I can make that decision. So what we know, many of our young people who've experienced trauma do not have the skills or the ability or the understanding of their own emotional issues or how to manage those. So we really need to build skills in our practitioners to help children do that. Number 4, how many of you work with adolescents? Okay, let's pray for you right now. Let's pray for you right now. Adolescence is a very difficult age, and hopefully I'm going to look at that when I look at a study and talk with you about what happens in adolescents who've experienced trauma. The behaviors that we see, the challenges that we see in adolescence are extreme. Drug use, sexual experimentation, running away, high-risk behaviors. Those are real tough for our caregivers, for our workers, for our foster parents, our adoptive parents. So we spend 3 days really looking very intentionally and intensely looking at what is happening to an adolescent and how do we work with that adolescent related to the language that they have, their behavior, which describes their pain. And we look at that. That's Module 4. Module 5, looking at the resilience and building resilience in young people. We are resilient. You wouldn't be sitting here today if you weren't resilient, You can problem solve, you can make decisions, you build relationships. Kids can't always do that. They don't have problem solving skills. They're walking around in such pain from their trauma that they're only in survival mode. It's like fight, flight, freeze, faint, flop. And if you say something wrong to me, I'm going to react. I don't think about it, I just react. So when we look at that, that's not resilience. Resilience is getting into the more executive side of the brain and making good decisions. And kids are not able to do that many times who have experienced trauma. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Module 6, how many of you pull groups together and do things with kids in camps and in groups? Hands up. Oh, lots of you. We really need to understand how to have trauma-informed activities for kids. Not just let's go and have fun. I mean, that's okay. Kids need laughter because it's good brain, brain juice. It gives all those good chemicals that help kids feel good. But we need to have activities in our camps that are intentional in our programs and camps, that are brain specifically neuron bouncers. We bounce neurons from neuron to neuron because what do we know? Neurons that fire together, wire together, right? Tell you more about that later. So we want to be intentional in our camps, in our programs, in our activities where we bring kids together. Yes, let's have fun, but let's have trauma-informed activities and be really careful about sensory integration as well. Module number 7, one of the things we find in our work, what we do, is that many of you, myself included, do not do a good job taking care of ourselves. Do you think that's true? I find it all over the world. When I ask this question, I go through the 7 skills that the National Child Traumatic Stress Network describes as being important. Self-care is one of them. And when I go through those 7 skills, I'll ask people all over the world, I say, which one is most neglected of those 7 skills? One skill is helping kids. All 6 of them are about helping kids. One of them is self-care. And you know, they all say self-care. That's the most neglected one. But you cannot be the wounded leading the wounded. We must take care of yourself. You need to be healthy. I need to be healthy in order to work with wounded children or crisis families. And you cannot get in the water without getting wet. So you jump into the story of a child, to the life of a family who's in crisis, you've gotten into the water. And we are not in the water one time. We're in the water daily. We're in the water 24 hours a day, many of us. And many of our workers are in the water 24 hours a day. They are getting wet. So the question is, what are they doing to care for themselves? So one of the things as we're building our own programs to be trauma-informed and to be trauma-competent, we want to look at what are we doing to help people and remind people to take care of themselves. Secondary traumatic stress is real. Post-traumatic stress disorder is real. I see it. You probably have as well. And we're recognizing that we have people that are so committed to do the work that they're doing and to serve so intentionally and intensely that they're in the water and they're soaking wet with their own secondary traumatic stress. So Module 7. Module 8 is really looking at how many of you are executive directors of an agency. As an executive director of an agency, one of the things we need to do is to be ensured that our policies and our procedures have clearly been examined to be trauma-focused policies and procedures, that we have nothing that flies in the face of what would be trauma effective. So it's just really looking at the structure and the system to be sure that we're a trauma-informed system as well. Now, I gave you these 8 to think about because I believe strongly that if we're going to build that program, build our programs to really be trauma effective, that those are the initial areas we want to be looking at. So keep that in mind, and we'll launch from there into looking at what we're doing here today. I want to give you kind of what our learning points are for today. So the first thing that we want to look at is that every one of us need to have a clear understanding of what trauma is and the types of psychological trauma that is out there. So we want to look at that, understand the typical stages of trauma, the types of trauma, and that children are experiencing. Number 2, we want to understand the lifetime potential of the impact of that trauma. Lifetime potential of the impact of that trauma. And it doesn't matter if it's a one-time trauma or an ongoing trauma. It all has the potential of a lifetime impact. Number 3, we want to leave here today understanding the essential elements of trauma-informed care. And so do we need to know and be able to do in order to really work with kids? And finally, we want to understand the role of the body of Christ in working with traumatized children. And it goes back to, we have scripture after scripture that talks about the orphan, and it talks about our responsibility related to the fatherless. And I think that you know those scriptures. We don't need to quote all of them. And we've got lots of documents in your bag that will have a lot of those scriptures in. But let's get yourself a rock collection. Get a journal. Write those scriptures down in that journal. That's your rock collection. And if you begin wondering why you're doing what you're doing, or what the promises are for you, or for the fatherless, or for children, go to your journal, your rock collection, and read those scriptures. Write them down. Get them in a whole lineup, those ones that are important and meaningful to you. All right. So we're looking at this module. And what this module is going to do, those 3 hours that you use, it is going to give you information that's going to help you become trauma informed, just that trauma awareness and that trauma information. What we're not going to get today in 80 minutes, we're not going to become trauma competent. Are you okay with that? I'm still working on it, and I've been training trauma and studying trauma and working in trauma for many, many years. Trauma competence is something I don't think we'll ever obtain. The research continues to come forth in how the brain is affected by trauma. We're learning all the time, and we'll talk all about that. So we're on the journey. And if we're going to be effective working with children and crisis families, we need to be a lifelong learner. A lifelong learner. So when we look at all of this, what we're saying is that, okay, I've got kids that I'm working with right now, and what is it like working with that child? Grab a child from the middle of the table, and you see those little paper there, those little children. And if there aren't enough, I have a few more up here. We can pass them around. But if anybody needs some more, you can come up and grab one. And what I want you to do with this, I want you to think of a particular child that you are working with in your program right now. Particular child. And what I want you to do is, with this child, I want you to first answer this question. To the best of your knowledge, take a pen and write this down, no names for the child, but on this child, I want, to the best of your knowledge, what abuse or trauma that you know of did this child experience? What abuse or trauma did this child experience? And just write it down, just real quickly write down. Okay. What are some of the things we have written down? Back table, one person. What did you write down about a child? One person from the table. Mother passing away. How about over here? Back table. Sexual abuse. Middle table. Abandonment. Rejection. Neglect. Sexual abuse. Fear. So when we look at this, those things that children have experienced, we know that those are difficult experiences for children. The next one, I want you to think about this child and write down how many moves and separations do you know that this child has experienced? Just jot down a number, what you think, or what you know. Okay, now, how many of you had children that you know have had 5 or more moves? Anybody here? Wow, 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 wow. 10 or more? Anybody? So we're looking at between 5 and 10, somewhere in there. When we look at that, we know that every time the child has to move, there are losses, right? And it's, how many of you love change? Is a move change for someone? Major change, major impact on the emotional health and well-being of a child. All right, last question. We have one more. The last question is, what are the behaviors their caregivers right now are managing that they're telling you, this is really tough, What are some of those behaviors that they're managing as well? Okay, those of you who had children who were, that was abandoned, who had the abandoned child, over here, over here. What behavior did you write down? Uh-huh. Okay. He attaches, just sort of clings on. How old is the child? 5 years old. Those of you who had, there are two of you who had children who had been, you wrote sexual abuse as behavior. What are the impact? What is the behavior you're seeing with sexual abuse? Yes. Lack of trust. As demonstrated by what? What shows the lack of trust? She just won't approach, won't trust anyone. Okay. Yes. Self-harm. Okay. Okay. What about other behaviors? Someone just give me another behavior that's challenging as well. Yes, please. Tell me again. Intense rocking. Yes. Other behaviors you're seeing. Anger and outbursts. Okay. Now, as we look at these, and we've only pulled out a few, but each of you at your table have just identified a child that someone needs to step into the story. Someone needs to step into that story being trauma-informed and helping that child. But I also want to point out that many times the children that we identify here are sometimes the children that people that, our caregivers don't necessarily want to be around. They're not, maybe they're not showing up for the program today, and the caregiver says, whew, thank goodness, they're not here. Because they're not necessarily real pleasant to be sitting around and dealing with those behaviors, but boy, do they need us. They really need us. And if we look at this, and we look at trauma, and we look at what's going on with the child, often children do not feel safe. They don't feel that they belong. Their needs, they don't feel are being met, nor do people even care to meet their needs. But what we know is globally around the world, and we look at what the world is telling us, what people who are in the profession of child welfare are telling us, children need 3 very specific goals. And the first one is that every child needs safety. And that's not just safety, they need to feel safe. That's very different than safety. So if I am thinking about safety, and it's called felt safety, and I tell you all, you are absolutely safe in this room. Do you feel okay about it? Kind of yes. But if a Galena were standing there at the door, and she had a big gun in her hand, and I said, oh, Galena, I know she's got a gun back there, and it's really a big machine gun, but you're really safe here. You might not feel as safe, right? Because you won't know her. You don't know why she has that gun. And thank you for walking in at the right time, Galena. But the issue is that children do not feel safe just because we tell them they're safe. And we tell them that all the time. In fact, I'm telling you is if I took you to Toronto right now and I said to you, okay, we're in Toronto and we're going to go for a walk in Toronto. It's midnight, pitch dark, and I'm going to put you into this road at the end, and I'm going to go 1 kilometer down the road, and it's very, very dark. You can't see anything. You have no lamps, no flashlights, and you have to walk from here by yourself, and I'll meet you at the other end. You're in a strange city, strange country, on a strange road. You don't know what the road's made of or what it looks like. Would you feel safe? Even if I told you it's safe, I've walked that road before? No, you're not going to feel safe. Safety is felt, and that's where we're looking for. We say children need safety. Well, we do. They need the physical safety. We need to create environments of safety for them. We need to put protective factors in place for them. But if they don't feel safe, they're not safe. They're not safe. Children need permanency as well. And permanency means that children, and this is what this whole forum is about, is connecting a child to a person, not to a place. Years ago, Ohio had a place called Ohio Soldiers and Sailors Home. And it would hold anywhere from 200 to 500 kids that were in an orphanage setting. And those kids would live there. They would live there like it was in an orphanage. And at one point in time, Ohio began to close those great big institutional settings, and Ohio Soldiers and Sailors closed. And when it closed, just about the time it was closing, there was this young man who graduated out of their program, went into the military. And in the military, when they give you leave, you could, kids, young men, young women, usually go back to their families and they do things. So this young man had military leave at Christmas time, and you know where he went? Back to Soldiers and Sailors Home. And it was closed. The building had closed down. He went back to a building. Nope, not a person. What we have in our statistics and our research is all of the children who are in care, in foster care, organizations such as shelters, institutions such as orphanages, that when those children leave, that only 1/3 of them are successful. That's the national statistics. 2/3 of them end up trafficked on the streets, suiciding, in prison, murdered, drug addicted. It's a terrible statistic. It's a UNICEF statistic. But here's the thing that they discovered, and I think it's important for us understanding trauma. That the children that were successful, they began to look at what were the variables, the things that were in place that really began to be common to those children who were successful. Well, one, we saw resilience, that they had problem-solving skills. They had some relationship-building skills. But do you know what the one really important one was when they went through the sieve and they kept coming down and down? Can anybody guess? Connected to a person, absolutely. It was one important relationship in that child's life that there was still a connection with. So it's people. That's where the health and permanency comes in. The last goal that we have that is a universal, well-accepted goal is that children need well-being, and that we have a responsibility to provide that well-being. What does well-being mean to you? Anybody give me what it means to you? Relationships, yes. Food, clothing, shelter? Yep. So we can go on. We probably have all kinds of things. You know, joy, happiness, that I know my history. I have a photo album. I mean, it could be many, many things to us that helps us to really feel connected and feel that we have a sense of well-being. So when we look at well-being, we have to look at the child's felt safety, the child's ability to feel that this is a place that is meeting my needs, etc., really has a lot to do with that we are meeting all of the developmental domains, physical, social, emotional, and intellectual, as well as the spiritual. So when we're meeting all of those domains, that is going to be more likely the elements needed to help that child have a sense of well-being. And we look at, are we doing that, and how are we doing that as well? Because what happens is that many of our young people, from early life on, what their early life on has been one of a lot of distress, a lot of events that have really been traumatic to them. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you a word, and it's a word that I already just had up there. This is what we're talking about. And I want you to give me some one words that talk about what is trauma. What's a word? Pain. Adversity. Disruption. Good. Loss. Grief. Insecurity. Good. Are those nice words? They're all negative, aren't they? So when we look at trauma, immediately we come back with words that are negative words. They're words that have not a pleasant sound. They're things that we don't want to embrace and walk around and experience every moment of our life. So trauma is stressful. There's absolutely no question trauma is stressful. And when we look at trauma, we have to recognize that our kids that we're working with have experienced all kinds of things that bring forth those words. I'm going to show you a little 5-minute video, my 5 to 6 minute video, real quick one. And what it's going to be, the video is looking through the eyes of a child and some of their experiences. I have worked a lot in India. I've worked a lot in different countries in Africa and other countries around the world. And I'll tell you, even though this is an American video, it represents many of the stories that I hear with the workers that are working with children. So let's look at this video. It's called Through Our Eyes, and we'll fire it up here for you.
My mother and my brother were murdered in front of me. He put the gun to my head, and he had me beg for my life. I was 10. I just turned 10.
It's hard to come out and say that I was a victim and that I was abused, especially when you're little, because it's like a big secret that's always on your back and that you never know when it's going to come out.
The image of my brother falling on that concrete floor and people stepping and just kicking with shoes on his face, I couldn't get that image out of my head.
Trauma is an overwhelming event. It takes away our safety, it creates a sense of helplessness, and it continues to affect our perception of our reality.
Some of the telltale signs of trauma are quite evident. Many of these symptoms, it's not that we don't see them, it's that we don't put together the entire sort of picture of what trauma is. Inability to sleep or interrupted sleep, inability to focus on what's going on, really not able to attend to learning. Adults need to be aware of children who are exposed to violence and intervene early and stop it.
I don't like the environment that I stay in. People getting killed every day, drug deals, people getting snatched, raped, cut up.
Whether it is a child who witnesses violence or a child who is the victim, you can't be fearful and be able to live your normal life. You have to be able to think clearly, and when you're traumatized, you can't do that.
Violence continues then to affect the child in their perception of their community, of their family, that danger is right around the corner. And the brain gets wired to expect danger.
My dad started actually physically beating me to the point to where I'd go to school with covered in bruises. I don't know how many times I've been threatened to be killed by my own dad.
My brother got shot in the head. He ain't make it.
It makes you afraid at times. It makes you feel that, oh my God, you know what, I just lost a friend, I just lost a family member. It just makes you feel that, hey, I could die next, I could be the next one dead.
What trauma does is it triggers what's called the amygdala in the brain, which is our fight, flight, freeze center.
And it truly is a change in the brain and a change in the stress hormones that are flowing through the body.
All our brains have what we call alarm systems. Because the brain now has been wired for danger and it's triggered into this fight-flight, we don't just get over a traumatic event. It continues to impact us.
I started hearing my mom scream in the middle of the night. And it got to the point where he started beating me and my sisters. I let my anger build up, didn't talk to anybody about it.
When you hold everything aside, it's like a bomb and it's like you're ready to explode and just somebody push that last button.
Most kids who've experienced violence oftentimes have experienced multiple types of violence. In the kids we see, the average number of different types of violent trauma is 4. And so complex trauma then affects multiple areas of the brain because it's ongoing.
Maybe it's gang warfare, maybe it's drug use and abuse in the family, maybe it's domestic violence, maybe it's bullying at school. And if there is a layering effect of cumulative violence, it changes literally the DNA.
It all started off with the hugging game. He would take us into his room. We would sit on his lap and he would hug us, and we weren't supposed to tell anyone.
When I was 5, I would have to leave kindergarten class and go home and have sex with this man who was in his 50s. I remember the long walk home and crying and falling down and having to get back up and walking on.
Child sexual abuse exists in the neighborhood, exists unfortunately at our schools, at our churches, at our homes, everywhere. And there are children out there suffering.
My first assault was in high school. I met a guy at a church, and he wanted to be my friend. I thought it'd be great, and instead he assaulted me, and I felt very scared.
When you have a child that doesn't get to work through that abuse in an appropriate manner, that abuse doesn't go away. It lives in that child.
Exposure to violence in childhood has been found to be associated with a really unbelievable range of long-term impacts.
Very young children who are exposed to violence many times have difficulty in establishing a trusting relationship. These children have fears.
You're twice as likely to develop depression. You're probably 3 times as likely to develop some type of anxiety disorder.
As they move into school age, they may have very, very serious behavior problems. As we look at adolescents, we see children running away. Sometimes children may be involved in the juvenile justice system, which puts the child at risk for being an adult offender. And so the cost of violence is staggering.
I felt isolated. Nobody knew what I was going through. To go 3 years without talking about it, I imploded.
Finally, after stressing and keeping everything bottled up and everything building up, I just finally broke down one day and attempted suicide.
Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death of children and adolescents in this country. We always ask in every case, what role might child abuse have played?
My mother, she knew that stuff was going on, but it just seemed like she didn't really care. She never stopped that abuse. And to this day, I've never forgotten what some of my family members have done to me.
These are traumatized kids, and so how do we then, as adults, professionals, caregivers, put a system around children that really is trauma-informed?
Happy feeling, good job, okay? So
what do we do differently to help rewire their brain? And then ultimately, how do we build capacity in order to really help our kids?
Everybody come together, whether it's in the community, in the home, in the school, wherever children are, and child by child, think of ways in which we can intervene early and educate people about what children need in order to grow, to thrive, and to continue to be resilient human beings.
The video, I think you can resonate with some of the things you've heard from children. Would you agree? I mean, it may be a video that is from another country, but when we look at the abuses that you wrote down, when you first wrote down on the child card that I gave you, there were some of the same things. The context, the culture, the environment might have been different, but the abuses are there, and it's what children are experiencing. And you also identified real clearly those feelings that kids have and what it does to them. When we look at this, I want you to look at the difference between trauma and stress. Trauma always causes stress. It always is toxic. It's producing chemical flow in the body that's really harmful for the body, harmful for the mind development, body development, and for the emotional development and health and well-being of a child. We also know that there's a lot of stress in our world. Would you agree? How many of you have experienced stress even while you're here? If you came a long way on an airplane, you experience stress, no doubt. Well, the issue is all stress trauma? No, we're going to have a baby in our family. Our granddaughter is going to have another great granddaughter for us next week, and that she's going to be born, and that's stressful. They're going to induce her. So, and if it doesn't work because of a previous child she had, they'll have to do a cesarean, and that's stressful, right? But is it happy time? Exactly. So stress can be really happy. Holiday, how many of you stress over your birthday when you have to cook food for everybody? Yeah, your birthday and you're cooking the food, right? That's where you go. So it's stressful. So when we look at those stressful situations and we think about that, stress is not always trauma, but trauma is always stressful. So it's just a little different. Not all stress is traumatic. Some is, but all trauma is stressful. All trauma is stressful. I'm going to give you two types of trauma. We've talked about one already. And that trauma is what I would call acute trauma, A-C-U-T-E, acute trauma. And an acute trauma is a one-off trauma. It could be like an automobile accident for a child. So there's that trauma. It could be a trauma where the child was raped. That's an acute trauma. It happened once. Acute trauma could be a loss or a death in the family. It's a one-time trauma as well. And remember, we already identified that that trauma can have psychological effects on the child for the rest of their life, right? We know that. One trauma can have a psychological impact on that child for the rest of their life. What we see in many of the children we work with is a different type of trauma. We see trauma that I refer to as complex developmental trauma. And what we're looking at, let's break that down. It's complex because it has many different layers of trauma. The mother may not have wanted that baby. Think about this. Psychological trauma can begin before the child is born. Physical trauma we know, because of not being cared for, et cetera, or having teratogen the mother ingests, et cetera. But psychological trauma can occur before the baby's born as well. So the mother doesn't want the baby. She's beating on her stomach. She's saying, this stupid thing inside of me, I hate this. She lives in a chaotic environment, and she has done everything she can to self-abort. And she doesn't take care of herself, and it just is chaotic. There's domestic violence and everything else that's going on. The mother's emotions are not limited to her. Those emotions, the sounds, the environment are also being received by the child. And that can be psychologically traumatizing to a child, an unborn child. So when we look at complex developmental trauma, many times what we're looking with the children that we're working with is that trauma started very, very early in their life. And then in addition to that, there may have been neglect. There may have been physical abuse. There may have been sexual abuse. It may have started early or started at school age, but it goes on for a period of time. It doesn't go away. Papa comes home drunk, he beats kids. Papa comes home sober, it's a good day. Papa comes home drunk 2 days later, he beats the kids. So there's that complexity in that trauma, the unpredictability in the trauma, but it just continues to go on and on. And we call it developmental because we see it happening through the maturational developmental milestones that a child normally goes through, that in their healthy environment allow that child to develop normally and healthily. But when a child is experiencing trauma and that psychological impact of that trauma, it affects the capacity of their body to move into those developmental sequences and to meet those milestones. And you probably have seen that. We had a foster child. We fostered for 15 years. We're an adoptive family as well. We have 6 children altogether and 11 grandchildren and 4 soon to be 5 great-grandchildren. So that's quickly a family thing. But when we had this one foster boy, he came to us as a teenager. He was like about this high at 13. He was a shrimp. He was just a little, wee dinky thing. He had been emotionally abused for years in his family, and they couldn't prove it. When they finally were able to prove it, and he came to be our foster son, we thought, little Robert, he's just this little winky dinky guy, and he wets the bed. He's 13 years old, and well, what we're going to do? We just thought, well, we're going to love him. We didn't know a whole lot. We're going to pour into him, and what we didn't know, we were doing trauma-informed strategies and didn't even know it. But we poured into him and just loved on him and just helped him to think about who he was and his emotions. We validated him and did a lot of things. And you know what? He started growing. He started growing. He graduated from high school up here. He grew and started growing at 13 years of age. And by the way, just the end of his story, he is an MT, emergency medical technician today, and he's got a lovely little family and a wonderful little wife we adore. And that's Robert. So, good little story. And so developmental complex trauma is that ongoing trauma that goes through those milestones of development. It's very complicated to sort it out, and it's chronic in the child's life. It's just chronic. It just doesn't go away. There might be a respite, but it comes back, and it's just always there. Psychological trauma is a result of that. What we see in complex developmental trauma, almost always it started early in the child's life. Almost always, it started early. Almost always as well, we see that chronic nature of it, it's just like there's emotional abuse, physical abuse, maybe domestic violence in the family, there's chaos in the family, and that's traumatic for a child, unpredictability. We also see almost always in complex developmental trauma, there's some type of maltreatment. And in addition to that, the caregiver causes further trauma by not protecting the child. I hear this all the time when I do trauma training. I hear it from us. We as adults, when have experienced trauma, myself included, went through a traumatic family kind of an environment. My mother didn't protect me. That's traumatic for a child, because who's to protect the child is that caregiver, that parent, that person that's there. It might be papa, grandma, auntie. But if that caregiver is not protecting, it's traumatic for a child. So it's almost always there's the lack of protection, the failure of the caregiver as well. And then how many of you have noticed that where some children are doing really well and other kids are not doing as well? But the same family, same chaos, it's resilience difference. So what we see is that when children look, it's different for them. They perceive it different, and that trauma comes about to them through a different lens. So the resilience of one child can sometimes help them separate that trauma, where for another child that trauma is much more affects them much more. I'm going to give you a little bit of a study. How many of you know the ACE study? Anybody here? Couple people. There's a study, and I want to encourage you to learn the study, to go in. You can look it up. It's called ACE study, ACE, and it's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences. ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I'm going to draw this study over here for you. So when we look at this study was done by two very reputable research groups. One was the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, and the other is Kaiser Permanente, which is a drug company. And the researchers, the research team was led by a man called Vince Folletti. I know him personally. I traveled Russia with him when we did a child welfare, child protection exchange from the U.S. and Russia. He's a brilliant researcher. And what he did originally in this study, he wanted to find out why American children were obese. They wanted to really discover what were the factors that so many U.S. children were experiencing obesity. And in the process of that study, what ended up happening is the study switched gears because they began to see different factors that were showing different outcomes, and those outcomes were related to those adverse experiences children had, and it was affecting their growth and development and their behaviors. Really some challenging things. So in the study, it was a longitudinal study that it started at conception, that they were looking at things when a child was conceived, right up to death. And in that, this is the ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and you'll find you're going to find all kinds of different ways of reading about it. But what they found out in this ACE is that over a period of time, that when children had these adverse childhood experiences, that these traumas begin to direct a pathway called a trajectory that was leading them towards early death. All right? You're going to follow me with this. So a trajectory is different than a projectory. So a trajectory, think of a rocket, if you will. A rocket that's put on a launch pad, and it's programmed to go to the space station. If it's programmed to go to the space station, where's it going to go when it takes off? The space station. Unless what happens? There's an intervention. There's an intervention. So the study says there is a map inside of that child that's gone through these adverse experiences that is sending them on a trajectory to early death, unless there's an intervention that is a trauma-informed intervention, a specific intervention. Now, many of us sitting here right now have had traumatic experiences, but we're here. So something has happened that's taken us off the trajectory, or we wouldn't be here today. So just know that yourself so you don't feel real bad about this whole thing. Okay, so when we look at this, what they begin to discover is that when kids, we're looking at even prenatally and those early life experiences, when we start to see that child on that pathway of those early life experiences, a little child we see all kinds of challenges in neural development. What might that look like? Give me a neural development activity for a child. Speech is one. Yes, absolutely. Speech, walking, muscle tone, sitting up, being able to crawl, scoot, those kinds of things. So when we look at this, little children, what we're seeing in this trajectory that are experiencing abuse and neglect, that are on these adverse experiences, and I'll tell you a little more about them in a minute, that we see neurodevelopment challenges. Needless to say, those persons that work in your programs, when a child has a neurodevelopment problem, speech issue, can't walk, needs muscle stimulation, caregivers are pretty easy to do that, right? We're engaged. We can do that. We feel okay about it. But what happens when that child gets to school age, what we see is we see social, we see emotional, we see intellectual, issues that really are hindering that child for being successful in school age. So now what's happening, teachers are calling your caregivers. They won't sit still. They don't do their homework. They're bullying everybody on the playground. Or they won't talk to anybody. They go hide in the corner in the playground. So we see those social, emotional, and cognitive issues, those intellectual issues. And what happens in the school age is that this gets to be a little bit more challenging, right? A little bit more challenging. But caregivers are still saying, okay, got to spend time with them, got to do the homework, got to spend the time. But what happens if the trajectory continues and if the chronic trauma continues there, what we begin to see at high school age, we begin to see high-risk behaviors. Now, when we see high-risk behaviors, what is that for an adolescent? Addiction, absolutely. Drug and alcohol, experimentation, sexual experimentation, carelessness in terms of things. They do stupid things. The run, I've seen this happen. I saw this happen in South Africa where kids were on one side of the street, and the big game was that they had like 5 lanes, or it was in South Africa, 4 lanes or 5 lanes of highway. I don't know, a whole bunch of lanes anyway. And what they had to do is kids that line up, and they would run across in front of cars. And it was a big game. It's a high-risk behavior. It's a stupid behavior, right? It's high risk. But kids that are not able to think through cognitively, are not using their prefrontal cortex, often get involved in things without thinking in these high-risk behaviors. Needless to say, no intervention, we're going to move on, and this is the young adult here, and what we see is disease. We see mental health issues. And we see all kinds of social issues as well. So when we look at this young adult, we look at the adolescent who was sexual experimentation, drug experimentation. Now we've got the young adult who's now getting the outcomes related to those adolescent behaviors. Sexually transmitted infections, suicide, ideation. Actually, we even see suicidal ideation starting here, but we're starting to see more of it even coming in here. The inability or unwillingness to connect to a person. So partner after partner after partner, marriage, divorce, or no relationship connections at all. And what are we leading to? The study said early death. That's where it leads. It is a devastating study. It is a devastating study. And in that study, and I want you to look at it, there are 2 categories. One is what's going on in the family for adverse experiences, and one is going on with the child. And there's 5 in each category. With the family, it's domestic violence, it's drug and alcohol abuse, it is incarceration, it's separation, and it's mental health disorders for a family. For kids, it's physical abuse, social or emotional abuse, sexual abuse. The child doesn't feel loved. And one more, I forgot it right now. So anyway, it'll come to me in a minute. But there are 5 in each side. Please look at the study. The study is worth your study and knowing it. Because when we understand it, it helps us to understand our activities, our interventions need to be brain nurturing activities. And the brain is a brilliant organ, When we look at the brain, how many of you know Dan Siegel and the work of Dan Siegel? Yay, 2 people, that's good. Dan Siegel, another person you can look up. Another, Bruce Perry. Another, look at TBRI, look at Karen Purvis and the Institute at Texas Christian University. Okay, so when we look at the brain, Dan Siegel explains the brain with his hand. And I'm going to give this to you so you understand as well. So if I look at my brain, and I put my hand like this, I'm going to close my thumb in and my fingers over my thumb. This would represent my brain. Okay, so what has happened, I'm going to break this down into places, parts of the brain, only 3, and I'm going to tell you what's going on in those parts of the brain. When my brain looks like this, my brain is talking to itself. It has crosstalk. This is an intact cross-talking brain. It's just having a wee of a time talking to itself. But when I go like this, my brain is not talking to itself. But here's what my brain is. This part of my brain, the palm of my hand, is the back of the brain. And that back of the brain is referred to as the reptilian part of your brain. It's your survival part of your brain. This is my brain stem, so that would be going down the back of my neck, and that's into my spinal cord, etc. So my palm of my brain is representing the reptilian part of the brain, the survival part of the brain. Then I take my thumb and I lay it across my palm. That's the mid part of my brain. So the mid part of my brain here, this whole middle area, is what I'm going to refer to as the limbic system. Okay, it's where your amygdala is, etc. But the limbic system, what lives in your limbic system? What lives there? Yes, emotions. Thank you, Jen. Emotions live there. That's where your emotions are. So these are my emotions. These are my survival behaviors. What are survival behaviors? Fight, flight, freeze, faint, and flop. Absolutely. Those 5. There's actually 6, but I just give you 5. So we're looking at those are my survival behaviors. Survival behaviors, emotions. All right. Now, right now, there's crosstalk going on. I'm upset. There's nothing going on here. I'm going to slug you. You're getting slugged, okay? But if I bring my fingers down, my fingers represent, when I bring them down, my prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, the front of the brain. What lives there? Reasoning. That's your executive functioning, right? That's your smartness. And you all got that. Okay. So when we look at this, if all this is in together, and I'm upset, and you've said something to me, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking, I'm not real happy with that. I'm probably going to go up here, and I'm going to make a wise decision to walk away. I'm using my prefrontal cortex, my executive functioning. I'm decision-making. But young people that are experiencing trauma, they are in their survival part of the brain, and we refer to that as red alert. They're walking around with their lid flipped. And how many times have we said to them, don't you feel bad that you hurt Johnny's feelings? They didn't have a clue, and they don't care anyway. Don't you know you're not supposed to do that? No. Don't you know I've told you that 500 times? Really? Children in these behaviors are not demonstrating these behaviors because they're willful or unwillful or naughty. They're demonstrating these behaviors because they are in pain. They are walking in their trauma. They are walking in their survival mode. It's not because they don't want to behave. It's because they can't behave. They literally can't. And church, we need to understand that. And we need to help our Sunday school teachers, our caregivers, and those persons that we work with to understand you have to care for this child differently. You cannot take your life experiences growing up with a normal, healthy child and expect to use those same strategies and not use any other strategies that are trauma. You've got to use trauma-informed strategies. It's critical. So when we look at this, and we look at the brain, I want to give you a picture here of the brain. Where are you? Hang on. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let me explain it a little different way. The strategies that we use in trauma-informed training, I'm looking at the actual strategies, and they're wonderful strategies. And those strategies are just simply really great things to do for all children. They're healthy for all children. Changing the way we're parenting. Right, exactly. And what I'm going to really encourage you to do, because this is an awareness 3-hour curriculum, it's not on strategies and what to do, but I'm really going to encourage you to go that next step. Once you've got the awareness down and you've got a real sense that you can talk about that with your caregivers, et cetera, then go that next step and look at those trauma-informed strategies. They're great things. Pouring into your child is a simple strategy. It is, I'm going to give it to you, even though it's not, I'm supposed to do it right now, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is a strategy. I love it, and it's so simple. And I think it is one that your caregivers would love. But let's just say, first of all, that this little child, and I'm going to make it a little girl, this is Susie. And, well, Susie's down here. And then this here is a generational line. Okay, so Susie's a child. She lives down below the generational line of adults. So above the line, we're going to just say this is we'll have Dad here. And then we'll have Mom over here. We're going to put a mom and a dad in this family. And they live above the generational line. Now, here's the thing. Susie is a foster child, and she is difficult. She is really difficult. She won't say thank you. She doesn't say please. She hides away. She doesn't trust anybody. And let's make Susie 10 years old, okay? So Mom and Dad, they're fostering this child, and Susie is just not grateful, and they would like a thank you. Do you think that's reasonable? I think it's reasonable. But for Susie, do you think it's reasonable? Remember? She doesn't know it's reasonable. So what happens is that we've got a trauma-informed strategy. This is just one. It's called a positive interaction cycle, and it's evidence-based. So when we look at this, what happens, Papa comes in, and he says to Susie, Susie, I'm going to go for a walk. Will you go with me? Mama says to Susie, hey, I'm going to go for a walk too. I'll go with you all. Let's all go together as a family. Mom says, hey, Susie, a little bit later this afternoon, I know you're going to be doing your homework. Can I just sit with you when you do it? Papa says, you know what, when you went to school this morning, one of the things I noticed is that you patted the dog. Thank you for patting that dog. Papa says, hey, I know that you really enjoy watching cartoons when you first get home from school. How about we sit together and watch cartoons really quick, and then I'll sit with you and help do homework too. So Mom says, I'm fixing dinner, Susie. I fixed your favorite thing. I really like it this morning when you got up and you said hi to me. And we just got this going. You see what's going on here? You see what's going on here? You're getting the idea? They're pouring into Susie, aren't they? What's not going back? Susie hasn't said anything, has she? She's probably said, no, I'm not going for a walk. I don't want your food. The adults have different responsibility. They live above the line. But watch what happens. They keep this up. Isn't that beautiful? They touch Susie's heart. You cannot continue to do the right thing and not touch a child's heart. And I go to your question. It's a beautiful question. The strategies that are there for you as you continue your journey in trauma-informed care are strategies we should be using for all children. It's honoring. Children are so precious. They're given to us, and just we have such a wonderful moment in time to really to pour into that child. I love this strategy, and I have seen this work so many times with kids. If you get a little, even a blinking of an eye, of a little smile going here, you know, I saw that smile. Thank you for that smile. I love Karen Purvis. If you've ever watched her videos, go on YouTube, download her videos. They're wonderful. TBRI videos, Karen Purvis. Dan Siegel has videos as well. But I love her videos. She'll say, you know, give me those sweet eyes. Look in my eyes. Collecting the eyes of the child. You cannot correct a child or redirect their behaviors until you connect with them. You've got to connect to correct. And the only way you're going to help a child to move from that trauma place that brain has been impacted by all that chemical flow that's changed their development and has caused them to be in a place of survival mode, is that you pour into them trauma strategies, and the neurons that fire together will wire together. You'll create new pathways. You'll bring children to a new place. It may never be exactly like you want it to be, but you will pour into that child and you will create new pathways. Jed? It's a beautiful question. And what Judd has just asked is he's asking about behavior, and I'm going to interpret it, and you tell me if I'm wrong. But looking at how do we interpret that? What does that really mean? And I want to give you what I believe is important. All behavior has meaning. All behavior has meaning. And when you see the behavior of a young person, every one of those behaviors is reflecting an underlying need. You got a child who's running away. It reflects a need. One of the things we look at, and I'll share this with you as well, is that in building trust, in building attachment with a child, we have to meet needs. That's the way you meet it. You don't meet it through correction. The research shows us that if you've got a child's misbehavior, lying, stealing, cheating, whatever, a child that's showing those misbehaviors, that if we go through the typical things of consequences, and heaven forbid, I don't believe in punishments, but we do use consequences, natural, logical, and artificial. But when we look at going through only consequences, it takes up to 200 times for that child to truly change that behavior, those consequences, 200 times. But if you approach it where the child gets to smile, gets to laugh, gets to play, gets to be encouraged, gets to hear you loving that child, you can manage that sometimes and up to 10 times. 10 to 200, hey, that's a no-brainer for me. You know, I want to collect that child's eyes. I want to collect their heart and their mind because I want to pour into the child. So when we look at this, and I want to give you this in terms of looking at the cycle, that all children have needs. We have needs. And what happens is if I've got a 2-year-old, let's take an infant. If I've got an infant, and this infant is hungry, that's a need, right? The infant's hungry. What does the infant do if they're hungry? Yeah. So what we see is we see a behavior. So the infant cries, wah, 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 and mommy says, baby's crying, baby's wet. So what does mommy do or daddy do? They respond. And in that response, what they do is they feed the baby or they change the behavior. That's the response. So when that happens, how does the baby feel? Satisfied. Baby feels good. So the baby feels satisfied, feels relaxed, feels rested. Baby cries again, hungry, whatever. Sees the behavior. Parent responds, feeding the baby. And what ends up happening is as this continues, the baby begins to trust this caregiver. That's attachment. All right? That's really a good thing. So when we're looking at working with traumatized children, we have to be absolutely intentional and consistent to recognize every one of their behaviors, even though we don't like them, is representing an underlying need. So I have to be a detective. So my detective work is looking at, okay, he is throwing stones and breaking windows. Don't like that behavior. But what I've got is I've got a child that's doing something that's representing an underlying need. What might the need be? Child's throwing stones, breaking windows, boom, 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 boom. Attention, excitement, control, safety, nurturance. I mean, it could be anything. I have to be a detective. But, okay, Johnny, you're breaking windows, so I'm probably going to have a consequence here. We're going to have to look at how you're going to pay for broken windows. But at the same time, I am absolutely going to have a strategy that's going to meet the need. Because if I don't, I'm missing the mark. Because if you don't, and this is something we can take back and share with our caregivers right away, it looks like this. Johnny broke the window, okay? We're going to make Johnny 13 years old. So Johnny broke the window. That's his behavior. Window broken. Parent is upset. That's it, Johnny. Go to your room. You're not going to ride your bicycle for a week. Johnny said, I'll get my bicycle. You can't stop me. Parent says, don't you talk back to me that way. Johnny says, I hate you. Parent says, go to your room right now, and that's it. You can't go with your friends this weekend. Johnny says, well, I'll show you what I'm going to do. And Johnny runs out the door and runs away. Ooh. I don't know about you, but I don't think any needs were met here. Do you think so? What do you think happens to the relationship here? It's a broken relationship, and it breaks the trust, absolutely. Johnny is not feeling satisfied. He is not building trust. He is not building a relationship. It is adversarial. It is just such a toxic relationship because all we are doing is we're just simply responding in a really punitive way to Johnny again and again. This is not building. Now, can Johnny get we have consequences, not a problem. But at the same time, if I'm going to apply consequences, they need to be as natural as possible. They need to be logical consequences. And at the same time, if I am going to meet Johnny's needs, I have to be a detective to determine what are the strategies that I also need to come side by side with that are trauma-informed strategies to help Johnny know that he's lovable, capable, and worthwhile. How do I build a relationship with Johnny? And looking at this. All right, I've got the slide up that I want to show you. And I want to look at what trauma does to the brain. It alters brain chemistry big time. Please do your study and your research, and you're going to find some fascinating information on this. The brain research is just continually giving us all kinds of new ideas on this. But it alters brain chemistry. What it also does is it damages the central nervous system. So now we look again at what we saw before in the ACE study. Begins to make a little more sense as well. It also damages the body's ability to handle the stresses that come in that are even just those normal everyday stresses. It just changes the body's ability to do that. The last thing on here I think is absolutely profound, and it really just disturbs me greatly. When it says that traumatized children, these little ones that we love so much, and want to help, and those adolescents that, you know, really we struggle with, but we still love them, those adolescents that they display levels in their stress hormones, that levels that are there that are similar to those that are seen in combat veterans. What does that say to you? It's scary, isn't it? It is scary. And when we look at this and we look at, I'm going to give you the most common picture of the brain that you see it on the internet all the time. And I've got lots of really good ones, and you can get them, just download them, that help you to see different kinds of scans. But this particular one, what we're looking at is we're looking at two brains. Same age child, same conditions, same kind of a moment in time, same age, 3-year-olds. And I want you to look at the brain on the left and the brain on the right and tell me immediately what you see different, okay? The size, right? Trauma impacts the size, the growth of the brain. We know that. But I also want you to notice, do you see the different markings in the brain? The darkness in different ones. Trauma changes the architecture of the brain. The architecture of the brain looks different in a child who's experienced chronic complex developmental trauma than it does in a child who's had a healthy upbringing. But here's the good news. Don't go away defeated. The neurons that fire together, the research is very clear, wire together. So you pour into a child. Teach your caregivers to do that. Do the right thing and do it consistently, intentionally. What you're doing is you're building new pathways. You're putting in those interventions that we talked about that are so important that we want to change the trajectory on the ACE study. We can do that. It is not hopeless. That architecture of the brain can be redesigned. And it's up to us. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes. The earlier, the better, by all means. The longer it goes on, the more significant the behaviors are and the tougher they are. But don't ever give up. I'm 73 years old, and I am still learning. I'm learning to play a ukulele. My husband's 77 down there doing training, and he's still learning. We have hobbies and things that we do. We just got a cat to learn how to take care of a kitten. We're having a great time as new parents. But don't ever think about the brain as being done. It is not done. It is not done. You want to stay young? Learn. Keep your brain active. Read, learn. If I can do it, then why would I ever give up on a child? Wouldn't ever give up, ever give up. Listen, it's time for us to call it. You've been great. I know I've just gone through a ton of information. I'd love to have another hour and a half with you or a couple of days because there's just like so much more. But download the material that I've got for you. It's a 3-hour. There's a whole lot more in this 3-hour module that we've got in our roadmap for you. And it's yours. And please use it. Take it. Feel absolutely okay to use it in any way you want. God bless you and thank you.